The chairperson of the African Security Sector Network, Niagale Bagayoko, says protection of civilians must remain at the heart of Africa's security and defense strategies. We're speaking with CNBC Africa's Kenneth Igboma on the sidelines of the Dakar International Forum on Peace and Security in Africa, where she says modifications in the continent's response mechanism are necessary to deal with new security threats. Take a look.
What is very interesting is that we can see that approaches are changing, because it's not my first Dakar Forum, it is my sixth one. And 8 years ago, it was completely different. There was really a requirement, a request for much more support from international partners, multilateral organizations, etc. And here, this time, we can see that there is a strong will from African leaders to get much more autonomy and to diversify all their security partnership. I think it is the first thing which is really striking, if I may say. The other aspect is that we can see that there is a recognition that all the international actors and national ones as well have been absolutely unable to cope with the kind of insecurity which has been spreading over all the Sahel, West African region, but also in Central Africa, in the Horn, or in Mozambique. So this is in fact a very worrying situation in the perspective of all the stakeholders which are taking part to this forum.
Yeah, because when you look at conflict on the continent and how it is spreading, like you rightly say, do you think we have the right security systems architecture to deal with the challenge that we're seeing play out?
No, clearly we can see that we can see that all the international architecture, both multilateral with the UN or the European Union and bilateral, has been completely unable to address conflict and insecurity. But we can also see, which is very worrying, that all the conflict mechanisms which have been forged during the 90s or the early 2020s have been completely unable as well to deal with the new kind of insecurity. For instance, conflict which were at stake in the 90s or at the beginning of 20, it was completely different. We had to deal with civil wars. Today, we have much more transnational threats and multidimensional dynamics. Yes, of course, there is a strong focus on terrorism, but if you look more in detail at what is at stake, you do have also self-defense groups, criminal actors, armies which are also found guilty of violating human rights. So we can see that all those mechanisms which have been conceptualized are today completely unable to provide efficient answers.
Yeah, now, of course, we've looked inwards in Africa, but let's look outward. And in terms of our international partners and their foreign policy towards Africa, how would you assess that? And would you say there's a preference for anyone?
From African leaders, that's what is very interesting today. It is the fact that we can see that traditional alliances, in particular with Western partners today, are completely challenged because lots of African leaders, but also, in my view, much more importantly, population at large, do consider that there is a need to have different kind of partners and not to be dependent on only kind of alliance. And there is also a strong will not to be trapped into competitions which are definitely not directly related with the security of the continent itself.
Yeah, because now one other critical part when you look at managing, if you're going to achieve stability, if you're going to address the security challenges, is conflict management. And looking at how the countries in Africa are positioned or more or less set up, do you think we have the right mechanisms to manage conflict?
Yes, we saw, for instance, that both the African Union and ECOWAS have been working very hard during the 90s and the 20s to set up intervention forces. And all those forces, in fact, haven't been able to be mobilized, for instance, in the Sahel. This is really a reason to worry about. And we can see that, for instance, this so-called African standby force is, in fact, much too complicated to be put on its feet as soon as a different crisis is emerging. And in fact, it's been exactly the same for the ECOWAS standby force. But we also can see that other prevention mechanisms, such as, for instance, all those protocols related to democracy and good governance, are also completely outdated, if I may say.
Because we have to talk about their effectiveness. Because now we're looking at unconstitutional change of governments playing out across West Africa. We're seeing this prop up. This was a challenge in the 60s and 70s. This has no place in 2020, 2021. But then even 2022, we're seeing that happen as well. But
exactly.
How then we use these mechanisms to address this solution? Because that's the tool. These were the tools built to solve that particular problem.
Exactly, but that is what I was about to tell you. If you look at those protocols meant to promote democracy and human rights and also good governance, you can consider that, in fact, all the principles to deter any unconstitutional changes of government are there. But the problem is that the way they have been applied have been completely hectic. And for instance, if today you can see lots of condemnation of military coups, it was not the case for what I would call civilian coups, because lots of African leaders have changed the constitutions of their own country to be able to run for a third mandate, which was not at all something which was planned by their constitution. So I think there is a need to focus much more on reviewing on those frameworks, but much more on applying them with good faith.
All right, because I see that you also have some expertise in peace building, and I would like more or less to get a sense how you think countries on the continent should be approaching peace building at a time like this.
Problem is that peace building itself, in my view, is also jeopardized by a number of challenges. And in my view, it is about all those very heavy processes which are mobilized, for instance, in terms of monitoring, evaluation, with lots of requirements to involve women, to involve youth, whilst it's not necessarily what is at stake. What we can see is that, in fact, all those peace processes have been much more promoted in a very standardized view rather than being guided by the context itself. And today, what we are witnessing, in fact, is a kind of context revenge.
All right, there are quite a lot to put out there, but as you leave this event, what would you like Africans to take from this conversation here?
I think that we can see that we are all kind of perplexed in front of this situation, which is going in multiple directions. But in my view, something which could be put at the heart of all those approaches is the protection of civilians, because we can see, in fact, that all those conflicts, all those violent actors have as main target civilians themselves. And rather than trying to cope with criminality, then with terrorism, then with promoting human rights, we should put the population and their own safety at the heart of all security policies of the continent.